Hello everyone, it's Clive again. I'm in Shanghai here for the summer visiting some old friends, and today I'd like to talk about some problems that I'm seeing a lot with students who are asking a lot of questions about the PS and how to most ideally approach it, but haven't really started writing anything yet. And a lot of students seem to have it in mind that they need to have a complete structure worked out, or a purpose worked out, or a theme worked out, or some kind of summary about themselves that they need to have in mind first, and then after they've got the structure of the essay and understand what the purpose of it is and where it's going, then they can start filling in the details. And I think from my experience that's not necessarily the way that good essays end up getting made. So I want to talk about a couple of examples of students' essays I've had before that actually really had very little structure to them, or even no purpose or no abstraction and no conclusion, but in some ways was still acceptable or reasonable enough essays, just to give you a sense of how you can set yourself free from the idea of having to know where you're going or feeling like you need to know exactly what you're going to say before you start saying it. So the first example I thought was a student of mine a few years ago who was very quiet and had a lot of trouble sort of understanding how to talk about his personal experiences, how his thought process had changed, how his ideas had changed over time. He wasn't necessarily the most reflective person, so I spent a lot of time with him trying to help him assess what his values were and things like that, to no real success. But as I was talking with him, he started getting very excited about this machine that he'd designed a while ago, and how he sort of modified this machine to make it more efficient in some ways. And he was clearly very thrilled and very excited about what he'd been able to do on this machine. And that often happens for me working with students, that there's sort of one thing, even very quiet students or students who don't really readily talk about ideas or values or things like that, or themselves. All of a sudden they can talk very passionately about this one sort of niche subject, and they're afraid to talk about it at first because it's not related to themselves, and so they rightly think it might not be appropriate for the personal statement. But then all of a sudden, even in a second language, they're able to explain to me for minutes this thing that frankly nobody cares about. And it's exactly those kind of things that they start talking about that is really what they need to be writing about. So I had this student write about his machine, and so he just wrote 2 pages about how he designed this thing and modified this thing and tweaked this thing to make it do what he wanted, and he was clearly very pleased with it. I tried to push him more into an abstract sense of what this meant about him or why this was important to him, but in the end of the day it just wasn't happening. But even so, I think it was an effective essay in the sense that you could read it and you knew that the student, you couldn't fake his enthusiasm for his little machine that he built. Nobody else really, most people wouldn't have wanted to or even dared to write an essay like that unless that machine was really their passion. And in a sense, reading it was the first time I felt like the student was really opening himself up. He was really taking a risk by talking about something that wasn't a standard personal statement. He was showing a passion that he wasn't even in control of, and I want to say it was even a little bit cute to see that this student clearly is not one of those slick, fast-talking guys who's going to make multi-million-dollar deals in a corner office, but he's clearly somebody who just cares a lot about his machine, and there was something very likable about that. Even though the essay didn't really get better or really didn't go in a different direction. And I think in the end of the day, having the essay that he did is definitely better than what you might imagine as the generic essay about how physics can be used to build better machines to help people live healthier, more effective lives or something like that. I've seen a lot of essays like that, people talking about how they think they can use their scientific knowledge to help people. And you can only read that essay so many times before you just start to feel disgusted and repulsed by it. So I think ultimately him being very vulnerable and just showing his unrestrained passion for how he'd been able to tweak his machine, even though he didn't talk about anything else, was already, and especially for him, like a pretty reasonable essay. Another example was a student who was very good at sketching, very good at drawing, also sort of reticent to talk about ideas and abstract level sort of things or reflections on society or the world she lived in or her place in it. It just kind of wasn't coming, and the more questions I asked, the less I was getting in response. So I had her do an essay, or I got her to start writing about her process of how she sketches or how she observes things. And all of a sudden she came back with all of these interesting metaphors about how she perceived an emotion in every surface and every texture and every curve. There's something I never would have thought about, and I think most people wouldn't have thought about, and how she looks at the world and she perceives these angry door frames, or she perceives these elegant telephone cables, or these passionate sink handles. And I mean, it was almost something that would make you think that she's got mental issues. But at the same time, it's something that makes you think that certainly she's an interesting person, and she probably has the capacity to be quite good at art, and she's thinking in some different way. And at the very least, again, it wasn't it wasn't a generic essay. And even though she wasn't able to talk abstractly about, again, herself, what she valued, what she cared about, and what her place in society was, it was still a fun essay to read. And I think it's still something that helped her stand out. As I was hinting at earlier, when you're writing these essays, you really should try to find a personal connection between this thing that you're interested in or you want to explain. Even though these essays I mentioned were not bad, to be honest, if you're applying to a top 30 school, you would be expected to be able to move back and forth between the realm of detail and abstraction, and understand how a detail is an example of an abstract idea, or how an abstract idea is manifested in a certain detail, and move back and forth between these two ways of thinking. So if you're shooting for that top 30 school, it probably will not be enough to just describe some sort of process that you think is interesting, or explain something that you're really passionate about. But you really could do worse than just spending 650 words explaining something that you like to explain to people. At the very least, it will probably be unique, because the thing that you want to explain is probably not something that everybody understands. It can come off as kind of cute in a nerdy way. Again, like, you get the feeling that this student maybe is not the most emotionally intelligent person, but they definitely care a lot about something, and that makes you sort of sympathize with them and like them. And it gives the admissions officer or the reader some insight into your competence. I mean, if you read an essay about how you perceive emotions in physical objects, then yeah, maybe you've got some issues, but also probably you're going to be good at art. And if you've written an essay about how you like to tweak a certain machine, then yeah, maybe you're not going to be the student union leader, but probably you'll be able to get through a physics course. So at the very least, you can not annoy people and show that you're competent at something. But the broader point for everyone, I think, is that you don't need to know what you're going to conclude about yourself before you start writing. You don't need to have a theme, you don't need to have a structure, you don't need to have a direction or even a topic. When you begin writing your personal statement, you really just can start by saying what you want to say to people but don't think it's appropriate to say. I'd recommend to students just take the pressure off yourself to come up with the perfect personal statement. Again, I've been talking with students a lot about theoretically what is the best ideal personal statement for me, without looking at anything specific yet. And honestly, we could talk about it all day. You could write a million different personal statements, and they could all be quite good. And as I've said many times before, there's not a single best personal statement for anyone. Anybody could write many different statements, and as long as it's personal, as long as it's interesting to read, then it's just going to be good enough. These things aren't necessarily decisive in your application. I think they're just a part of a broader application. So as long as they're covering the main points of being about you, and there's no such thing as the perfect personal statement. There's just good enough personal statements. So yeah, remember the prompt number 6 in the Common Application, which asks you to describe a topic, idea, or concept you find so engaging that it makes you lose track of all time. It says, why does it captivate you? Or who or what do you turn to when you want to learn more? So it does ask you, why does it captivate you? And that's important. But the crux of the question is just saying, go ahead and describe something that you think is interesting. Just go ahead and explain to me something that you think is really cool and you want to talk about. It could be a machine, it could be your thought process towards one of your hobbies, or your method of practicing something, or something that is meaningful to you, but normally you don't think anybody would care about. Like maybe it's even the way that For example, I like to drum, and I like to think about how when I'm using a double pedal, I like to make my downbeat on the right foot, my upbeat on the left foot, and that by disciplining myself to organize downbeats and upbeats physically, then somehow I feel like it makes the left-hand side of my body smarter. Like that's a very small part of who I am, but it's something that most people don't care about and is not interesting to most people. But I think if I were to write an essay about that, you'd at least get the sense that I was sincere about trying to improve myself as a drummer and reflective about what I'm doing in life, and at least have some kind of potential. And again, it's guaranteed not to be an essay that somebody else will write, so it helps you there as well. And maybe an even broader point is that I think a lot of good writing in any genre begins with some kind of inspiration and not necessarily a plan or a goal when you start out. And I wish I could recall who it was who said this, but a famous author was saying that he often started writing just with a very simple sentence that seemed to somehow excite him, just a concept of a person in a cafe, and then you start thinking, well, why is this person in the cafe? What has brought them there? So you start with that tiny sentence, and then you ask yourself questions about that sentence, and you try to explain that sentence. And I think personal statements are very much the same way, in the sense that you just want to start writing about something that captivates you, and then work towards explaining, asking yourself, okay, why does this captivate me? What does this mean to me? And then you gradually modify the essay to fit the requirements of the prompt. But again, the point is to try to go back to whatever it is that you have a passion or you have some kind of a need to explain to people, even though you sense that most people probably wouldn't care about it, or it's not really appropriate to mention it in small talk or everyday conversation. Start with that one thing that captivates you, and then try and build that out and ask yourself questions about why it captivates you and develop that into your essay. Again, you don't need to know where it's going to go or what you're going to conclude about yourself, if anything. The point is to start with that inspiration and then just keep asking questions. So, final thoughts: stop asking me questions about the PS and just start trying to write something, and ask yourself what it means to you, and you can build the essay from there. Alright, well, that's all I got for you. Take care, and I'll talk to you later.